Welcome, Nocturnal Minds, back to our class. Oh, you are really study hard. Building upon our previous discussion of the foundational principles of physics and their implications for psychological science, we now turn our attention to the broader landscape of social sciences. This domain presents a fascinating array of challenges and questions that push the boundaries of how we understand scientific explanation, especially when dealing with complex human societies. We'll be exploring four particularly thorny issues that have kept philosophers and social scientists up at night for decades. So, let's dive right into the first puzzle: models and reality. You know, it's a classic headache in social science, maybe even more so than in some natural sciences. We build these elegant models, often based on assumptions that are, shall we say, creatively optimistic about the real world. Take that cornerstone of microeconomics: firms maximizing profits by producing where marginal revenue equals price. Sounds neat, right? But hold on, do firms actually do that? In reality, are they really just profit machines? Or do they have other goals, like market share or employee satisfaction? Are they truly price takers in a perfectly competitive market? Or do they have some clout, some ability to influence prices? What about government regulations, wars, quotas? Suddenly, those clean assumptions start looking pretty shaky. The big question then becomes, if our model is built on sand, how can it possibly explain anything solid in the real world? And how do we tell the difference between a model that's a useful approximation despite its flaws, and one that's just plain wrong? Now, it's not all the same kind of unrealistic. Think about it. There are two main flavors here. First, you have idealizations. These are like saying, okay, in this model, let's pretend firms are small enough that they don't mess with the overall market price. Now, in many real markets, this might be approximately true. The firms are tiny compared to the whole pie. So, it's an approximation, a simplification that captures something roughly accurate. Then there's abstraction. This is more like saying, let's just ignore government interference for a moment. That's not an approximation, it's a complete omission. Government interference is a real thing in the world, but we're just sweeping it under the rug in our model. Understanding this distinction is crucial because the ways we might justify or critique these different types of unrealistic assumptions could differ. So, how do people try to square this circle? One famous answer comes from Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist. His take, echoing a broader philosophical stance called instrumentalism, is pretty blunt. Who cares if the assumptions are true? The only thing that matters is whether the model works. Its job isn't to tell us why things happen, but to predict what will happen. Think of it like a tool, a map perhaps. A map doesn't claim the territory is flat, it just helps you get from point A to point B. If your economic model predicts exchange rates accurately, even if it relies on unrealistic assumptions, it's a good model. But, and there's a big but here, many folks find this unsatisfying. We study social phenomena not just to make predictions, but to understand them. We want to know why crime rates go up, not just that they will go up next year according to the model. We need confidence that the model isn't just lucky, and ideally, we want some reason to believe it's tapping into real underlying causes, not just correlations or convenient fictions. Another popular defense is the ceteris paribus clause, all other things being equal. The idea is that statements like firms produce where MR equals P aren't actually false, they're just conditional. They mean firms produce where MR equals P, assuming no other significant factors are messing things up. It's like saying Newton's law of gravity holds, assuming no other forces are acting. Now, defenders point out that even physics uses this. Fundamental laws often describe isolated effects, but objections fly fast and furious. First, isn't this just making claims unfalsifiable? If a prediction fails, just wave your hands and say, well, other things weren't equal. How do you ever prove the original statement wrong? Second, if you can actually specify what those other things are, say government subsidies or strategic pricing, why keep them outside the model? Just add them in. Then it's not a ceteris paribus law anymore. It's a more complex, potentially less universal, but still testable law. Plus, the physics analogy gets shaky. While combining forces is complex, the basic laws themselves often have clearer rules for interaction than trying to pin down all the other things affecting, say, firm behavior in a dynamic economy. Okay, so maybe the problem isn't the truth value of the statements, but how we think about theories themselves. Enter the semantic view of theories. This perspective, championed by philosophers like Patrick Supps and others, takes a step back. It says, hold on, are we even thinking about theories correctly? Instead of seeing a theory as a set of claims that are either true or false about the world, it sees a theory as defining a kind of abstract entity, a possible model. Think about the theory of evolution. On this view, it's not primarily stating facts about Darwinian systems. It's defining what a Darwinian system is, something with heritable variation and selection. Whether any actual system in the world fits that definition is then a separate empirical question. This approach neatly sidesteps the awkwardness of saying social science laws are only conditionally true. But does it solve the problem? It just moves the difficulty elsewhere. We still need to figure out which of these abstract models actually correspond to reality. How do we know our model of a perfectly rational, self-interested agent, even if it's abstract, actually describes something happening in the real world? So, if we can't just rely on truth or predictive power alone, how do we judge these models? Philosophers have thrown around several criteria. Does the model provide insight? That sounds nice, but what is insight? Is it just a warm, fuzzy feeling? Can we measure it? Does it unify different phenomena? Sure, explaining apples and oranges with the same model sounds impressive. But what if the model is just a boring, repetitive story applied everywhere? Does it serve as an instrument? We can manipulate models, sure, but we can also manipulate abstract fantasy worlds. Does it being an instrument mean it reflects reality? And finally, is it isomorphic to reality? Meaning, does it have a one-to-one mapping with the world? This sounds promising, but how do the idealized parts map? Do perfect foresight agents map to real people? And what about the omitted factors in abstractions? If we leave something out, how can it be part of an isomorphism? Each criterion seems to have its own set of problems. Maybe the key lies not in abstract properties like insight or isomorphism, but in something more concrete, causality. What if the magic ingredient is showing that the model, despite its unrealistic bits, is actually capturing real causal processes? Think about it. If I can show that the insight offered by the model is really about understanding a specific causal mechanism operating in the world, that feels more substantial than just a gut feeling. If the same causal process explains different phenomena, that's a deeper kind of unification. If I use the model as an instrument because it helps me understand and manipulate real causes, that gives me confidence. And if I can identify the causes posited in the model and show they exist and operate in the real world, then I'm starting to build a bridge from the abstract model to actual explanation. The million-dollar question then becomes, how do we demonstrate that a model with unrealistic assumptions is actually picking out these real-world causal gears? So how do social scientists try to pull off this feat of showing a model captures real causes, even when it's got unrealistic bits? Well, there are some strategies in the toolkit. One is the refinement test. You take an idealization, say the assumption that firms are price takers, and you relax it slightly. Maybe you allow for a few dominant firms. Then you see if the model's predictions still hold reasonably well, or if they break down. If they still work reasonably well, it suggests the original idealization wasn't too far off, or at least wasn't capturing something essential. Another technique is sensitivity analysis. Here, you deliberately add in various complicating factors, maybe taxes, or consumer preferences, or network effects, and see how sensitive your model's core conclusions are. If the main result holds firm even when you throw in these extra complexities, it gives you more confidence that the original model wasn't just riding a wave of simplification, but was actually onto something fundamental about the causal structure. Of course, there are likely other methods too, drawing inspiration from how the natural sciences handle their own share of idealizations. All right, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about mechanisms. This brings us to another big debate. What kind of mechanisms do we need in social explanations? And closely tied to that is the idea of methodological individualism. This is the doctrine that says, ultimately, everything in the social world should be explained by reference to individuals and their actions. Think of it as the reductionist program for social science. The idea is that if we can just explain all social phenomena using individual behavior, we've achieved the deepest level of understanding. For this to work, we'd need bridge laws, those conceptual links that translate between the language of social science and the language of individual psychology or sociology. Like needing to define temperature in terms of molecular kinetic energy to reduce thermodynamics to mechanics. But here's where the rubber meets the road for reductionism: multiple realization. This is a killer argument against simple reduction. Imagine the concept of a chair. A rocking chair is a chair. An armchair is a chair. A futuristic hover chair is also a chair. All these different physical things realize the same functional category, the chair. There's no single physical description that applies to all chairs. Similarly, think about a business firm. How is a firm realized at the individual level? It could be a small startup with a few passionate founders. It could be a giant corporation with thousands of employees following complex procedures. The specific behaviors of individuals involved can vary wildly, yet the overall entity, the firm, behaves in certain ways, like pursuing profit. Why? Because the competitive environment cares about the firm's overall performance, not the nitty-gritty details of how individual employees contribute. This suggests that social categories like firms capture patterns and functions that aren't reducible to any single configuration of individual behaviors. The term firm does explanatory work that individual descriptions alone can't easily capture. Now, before we dismiss the idea of mechanisms altogether, let's clarify what we're talking about. The demand for mechanisms isn't always clearly defined. Are we talking about identifying a continuous causal chain, like dominoes falling one after another? Or are we breaking down a complex system into its components and explaining how they interact, like analyzing an engine's pistons, crankshaft, and valves? These are different kinds of mechanisms. Also, is the mechanism horizontal, detailing steps between a cause and effect, or vertical, explaining a whole by its parts? Furthermore, are mechanisms necessary for any explanation at all, or just for a complete one? And what counts as a mechanism? Is it the quantum-level details of inheritance, or just the genetic code? Mechanisms seem relative to the level of detail we're interested in. Making these distinctions helps us see if demands for individualist mechanisms are always justified. So, why this obsession with individual-level mechanisms? Why can't we explain things using other macro variables? Well, sometimes individual-level detail is incredibly fruitful. But is it essential? If we push the reductionist argument to its extreme, we end up needing quantum mechanical details for every explanation, which seems absurd. So, the reasonable conclusion seems to be, individualist mechanisms can be useful, but they aren't the only game in town. When might they become particularly important? It seems to hinge on a few things. First, does the social explanation rely heavily on strong assumptions about how individuals behave? Second, how shaky is our knowledge at the social level itself? Are we just making educated guesses about macro trends? Third, how solid is our knowledge about individual behavior? Can we actually specify the relevant mechanisms at the individual level? Generally, individual mechanisms become crucial when we have speculative theories at the social level, but we have reasonably good evidence about individual behavior. In other situations, focusing solely on the individual might be missing the forest for the trees. Let's move on to a third big topic, evolution and function. This has deep roots in the social sciences. Think back to the 19th century. Herbert Spencer's ideas about social competition and selection were actually influential on Darwin himself. Ever since, social scientists have been quick to talk about functions of norms, institutions, and social practices. Marx argued the state exists to protect ruling class interests. Durkheim claimed the division of labor promotes social solidarity. But this raises some tricky questions, especially after Darwin revolutionized biology. How do these social evolutionary explanations stack up against biological ones? And can the social sciences provide a rational basis for teleology, the idea that things exist for a purpose or function, in the same way Darwin provided a mechanism for biological adaptation? These functional claims pop up everywhere. Marx looked at the state and said, essentially, its function is to protect the ruling class. Durkheim looked at the division of labor and said its function is to foster social cohesion. These are powerful claims, suggesting a purpose behind social phenomena. But what do they really mean? How should we interpret statements like the state exists in order to, or the division of labor exists in order to? Are we attributing intentions to social structures? Or is there a more neutral, causal way to understand these functional claims? Some philosophers have tried tackling this by trying to pin down the exact meaning of function. They look at our intuitions about everyday uses of the word. But Kincaid argues this whole project is often misguided. Many useful concepts in science don't have those crisp, definitional boundaries. Plus, relying on ordinary language intuitions might not be the best way to clarify scientific issues. However, one distinction that emerges from this literature is helpful. There's a difference between saying a part of a system has a function in the sense of having a specific causal role, like the heart pumping blood. This is common in social science too, breaking down complex social systems into interacting parts. But then there's the stronger claim that something exists in order to fulfill that function. Marx wasn't just saying the state protects the ruling class. He believed the state is there because it does so. This implies a purpose or reason for its existence. How can we understand these stronger claims of existing in order to? One approach is to see them as causal claims about feedback loops. Think about it. If a practice, norm, or institution has a certain effect and then persists precisely because of that effect, we can interpret existing in order to as describing that causal relationship. Darwinian natural selection is a prime example. A gene has an effect, and it persists in the population because of that effect via survival and reproduction. But this causal pattern isn't limited to genetics. Look at organization ecology. Researchers find that certain organizational strategies lead to better survival and growth in specific environments, so those strategies persist. Or consider cultural transmission models, like those developed by Boyd and Richardson. Cultural traits persist because they enhance the fitness of individuals who adopt them. In each case, something exists because of the effects it produces. Now, the most common objection to applying evolutionary thinking in social sciences is the illicit biological analogy. People say, hold on, there are no social genes, institutions don't reproduce. Fair point, but Kincaid argues this misses the target if we stick to that distinction between the general causal pattern of something existing because of its effects and the specific mechanism of Darwinian natural selection. Literal copying of coded information or biological reproduction isn't strictly required. In fact, philosophers of biology themselves acknowledge that there are selectionist processes in nature that don't involve literal gene copying or survival of organisms in the traditional sense. So, while the biological analogy might be imperfect, explaining the existence of social practices by their effects doesn't automatically make the explanation suspect. The real challenge remains: how do we actually confirm these kinds of functional explanations in practice? Finally, let's tackle the perennial issue of fact and value. For a long time, the ideal was that science, including the social sciences, should be value-free. Objectivity was paramount. But then came the historical and sociological turn in science studies, famously kicked off by Thomas Kuhn, which made everyone a bit nervous about the idea of pure objectivity. Add to that the fact that social sciences often deal directly with value-laden topics like justice, equality, morality, and frequently provide policy advice. Suddenly, the value-free ideal looks a lot murkier. We also have to ask, are the basic building blocks of social science, like race, gender, or class, discovered natural kinds like sodium, or are they socially constructed categories, inherently tied to our values? And lurking beneath it all are the big debates in meta-ethics about whether moral and political values themselves can be objective. To make progress on this tangled web, Kincaid suggests we need to break down the claim that social science is value-laden into different dimensions. First, what kinds of values are we talking about? Are we concerned about epistemic values like seeking truth, or moral and political values like justice or freedom? Second, how are these values involved? Are they directly shaping the research process? Or are they implicated only by implication, for example? A finding about poverty might have normative implications, even if the finding itself is value neutral. Third, where are the values involved? Are they influencing the researcher's personal goals, like getting tenure? Or are they embedded in the very concepts and evidence used in the explanation? Finally, and perhaps most critically, what effect does this involvement have? Does the presence of values necessarily mean the loss of objectivity and truth? Let's look at an example. Gunnar Myrdal, studying underdevelopment in the mid-20th century, famously argued that mainstream economics was deeply value-laden. His target was the focus on equilibrium states in growth models. Economists were obsessed with stable, balanced growth paths. Myrdal contended that this obsession inevitably led them to ignore crucial non-equilibrium dynamics, things like sudden shocks or crises which he felt were central to understanding underdevelopment. Where did this bias come from? From their trust in markets and distrust of government intervention, essentially their political and social values. How can we interpret this? One way, drawing on recent work on context and explanation, is that explanations answer questions, and questions are shaped by context. Myrdal might be suggesting that the focus on equilibrium assumes a specific context, a context shaped by pro-market values. This doesn't necessarily mean values are always involved in providing the evidence, but it shows a way they can be deeply embedded in the very act of explaining. Once the question is fully specified, however, the answer might still be objective. Another line of argument comes from philosophy of language, particularly W.V.O. Quine's views. The idea is that the meaning of any concept is determined by its role within our entire web of belief, including our moral and political beliefs. Since our language inevitably contains value-laden terms, there can be no completely pure, value-free language, and thus no value-free science. Hilary Putnam has pushed similar arguments. But does this work? Kincaid doubts it applies universally. Maybe calling DNA the master molecule involves some metaphorical value judgment, but surely not everything in science does. And what does it imply? Does molecular biology depend on gender roles to describe protein synthesis? It's unclear. However, Root and Dupre argue this kind of argument might have more traction in the social sciences. Why? Because social science deals with things inherently important to humans. Describing spousal abuse, for instance, seems to involve a value judgment. Trying to strip away the value by using thinner terms like physical assault still leaves residual values, and might even obscure what we're actually interested in studying. So, what does all this mean for the objectivity of social science? The standard worry is that since moral and political values are subjective, any science using them must also be subjective. Now, whether moral values are subjective is a huge debate in philosophy, metaethics, that we can't resolve here. But even if we grant that moral values are subjective, does that automatically make the social science that uses them subjective? Not necessarily. Think about it. Scientists studying spousal abuse could explicitly state their moral assumptions, what they count as abuse, why it matters. Then, the results could be evaluated relative to those assumptions. Researchers could explore alternative findings based on different assumptions. The core findings, the descriptions, the causal relationships uncovered could still be objective, even if interpreted through a subjective lens. Making the assumptions explicit allows for critical evaluation and exploration of alternatives, preserving the possibility of objective inquiry even in value-laden domains. And that brings us to the end of our whirlwind tour through some of the deep philosophical waters of the social sciences. As we've seen, these fields grapple with fascinating and challenging questions about how we model reality, what kinds of explanations are valid, how we understand purpose and function, and how we navigate the inevitable interplay between facts and values. There are no easy answers, no single correct approach. But hopefully, this exploration gives you a clearer map of the landscape and the kinds of arguments and distinctions that help us navigate these complex issues.